Why do you think in the property industry isn't really talked about very much, and it's one of those things most people haven't come across or haven't heard?
Our biggest issue with capital allowances is raising awareness around this subject. We are seeing a lot of people who are getting into like the assisted living space and the service to accommodation space where the margins are quite thin, especially at the startup point. If we're able to come in and advise you on the capital allowances that are available and say, right, based on this and your acquisition and the money that you've spent, we'll be able to find you X amount of allowances, maybe 50,000, maybe 100,000.
When someone's thinking about capital allowances, what would you say kind of like 3 tips to be just mindful of?
You want to ask the question first off, whether the vendor has actually claimed capital allowances. There's no point being shy about it. I mean, depending on the circumstances, but more often than not, you want to ask the question and find out what they've done.
And if they don't know what you're talking about, it's very likely they haven't.
Which is perfect. And I mean, that's what we want them to say, that we don't even know what capital allowances are.
Usman, so you're the man that's responsible for claiming back £63 million in capital allowances from the taxman, averaging £160,000 a person just in the last 5 years.
In the last 5 years, yes.
So what does that even mean? What are capital allowances?
What are capital allowances? Okay, so capital allowances are a HMRC approved tax break. It's not a scheme, it's not a loophole. It's been around since like the 18th century and it's enshrined in UK legislation.
Okay.
It's just evolved over the years. And the current format of it as it is, essentially, it's just a tax break on anyone who owns a commercial property. So every single commercial property that you own or you buy or you invest in will have capital allowances embedded within it. Now, what does that mean? I mean, we're going to a deep dive of what capital allowances are. Essentially, it's all the plant and machinery and integral features embedded throughout the property. So everything except for the bricks and the mortar and the structure, essentially.
So when we talk about plants and machinery, so let's say in an office building like this, there's no machinery or plant that I would see. So what are we referring to?
So we are referring to now, just looking around, we're looking at the lighting throughout the embedded throughout the property. We're looking at the heating, the ventilation, the wiring and the switchgear in the walls, all the electrics, every plug socket, light switch, every door handle, door lock, all the ironmongery embedded throughout the property. We've got all the kitchenware, so everything from the single base units, the wall units, the kitchens, the washing machine. Then you've got your sanitaryware, so everything from the WCs, wash hand basins, towel radiators, mirrors, tile splashback, all of that stuff.
So just because I can't see any heavy machinery, it doesn't mean that there's no allowance?
No, absolutely not. I mean, we're talking about fire alarm systems, CCTV systems, security systems. We're talking about elevators. You're talking about specialist things. If you've got something like a care home, stair lifts, the typical type of bath accessories they have for disabled patients and so on, there is such an exhaustive list. But essentially, those items that we just discussed are embedded throughout every single property, not just an office. And there's value, significant value in all of those, bits of plant machinery.
Why do you think in the property industry isn't really talked about very much, and it's one of those things most people haven't come across or haven't heard?
Our biggest issue with capital allowances is raising awareness around this subject. That's all it is. It's just because no one knows about it. It's a massive tax break, and it's just not known. I mean, the current kind of stat is something along the lines of about 80% of commercial property owners haven't claimed capital allowances or even aware of claiming capital allowances. And all we're doing is we're on a mission to really hammer home the importance of these allowances and the fact that you need to be claiming this and you're entitled to this relief. So why are you not claiming it? It's out there and it's available for everybody, including the SME market, which is who we target primarily. And it's just about raising awareness because it's just no information about it. Conveyancing solicitors aren't aware of this. Property specialists just generally aren't talking about it, which is why us as specialists, it's just a niche area of tax essentially. Yeah. And we're just on a mission to try and...
Yeah. We were speaking off camera earlier and I was saying it's probably 12, 13 years ago when I first came across this and I thought, I couldn't even believe it was actually real at the time. Yeah. The amount of claims that were kind of going in. So when we talk about commercial property, are we talking about an office building or what type of buildings are we talking about?
Literally anything commercial. So you can it goes from retail units, warehouse units, offices, care homes, restaurants, hotels, conference centers, gyms, public houses, anything commercial.
So let's maybe do it the other way around. What does it exclude? What type of property is excluded?
Residential is excluded.
Okay.
But even then, there's a subdivision within residential because you've got serviced accommodation, which is residential. But essentially, if you're running that residential unit as serviced accommodation, you're bringing it into commercial use. Mm-hmm. If you buy a residential unit and you decide to run it as an assisted living unit, that qualifies. You're bringing it into like a care home kind of use. So that qualifies as well. You're bringing a residential property into commercial use, and that trade is what qualifies that property to claim capital allowances. So whereas before it didn't qualify, all of a sudden you've brought it into qualifying.
So this is nothing to do with its planning use or what planning permission is being granted. It's how the property is being used.
You need to have both the commercial activity and the commercial trade to qualify to claim capital allowances. So the trade is you have the property and the activity is whatever it is that you're doing within it. So if you're running it as a normal AST, it's purely residential. There's nothing about it. Long-term lets, have never qualified for capital allowances. Well, they did back in 2012, but it was a minimal claim. They changed the rules. But now you're just running it, and we just need to prove the fact that you're hitting the qualifying criteria, that it is a commercial venture and it is commercial activity.
Yeah.
For that reason, that income, rental income that you get from it will qualify to claim capital allowance tax relief.
And we mentioned earlier, just at the beginning, typically, some of the claims like £160,000 for an individual.
On average per person, yeah, it's typically.
So if we looked at a typical office building, let's say we looked at a shop, 3-story, I don't know, 300,000 purchase price, and you convert that to, say, 3 apartments and maybe a retail unit downstairs, and you've purchased it and gone through that sort of expenditure. Could you hazard a guess of what sort of number we'd probably be looking at as an individual for capital allowances claim?
Retail units and warehouses are typically on the lower end of the scale, purely because you have to look at what they are. You've got just a shell that's got stock in it or machinery, same as warehouses. So there's not going to be too much embedded within it, aside from maybe the incoming mains, some lighting, some heating, some wiring and switchgear.
So that's probably a bad example then, because a lot of it's residential as well.
The residential element wouldn't qualify again unless you brought it into commercial use, running it as service accommodation or assisted living or something along the lines of that. But typically above retail units, you don't get that. But yeah, retail units are probably the lower end, but it depends on what it is, because most people will buy a retail unit, do an extensive refurb, and then we can claim the refurb expenditure in addition to the purchase price and everything that was embedded within it originally. So in combination with that, it becomes slightly viable. But yeah, typically that's probably the lower end of the scale. That's not to say that it's not viable. It's every case is viable, but that's the lower end. But typically the ones that the high value and the high ticket items are the offices, are the care homes, are the restaurants, are the kind of banqueting halls, are the hotels. They're the ones that have a massive amount of capital allowances embedded throughout them, because the electric systems and the ventilation systems and the kind of data communication kind of bits in an office, fire alarm systems, CCTV security systems embedded throughout the property are significant. So that's where the real kind of money is.
You touched on just a few moments ago about when it was purchased. So when is the right time to be making a claim? Is it once you purchased and renovated? Is it right at the front when you buy, or before you buy? At what point should somebody be thinking about the capital allowances element?
You should be thinking about it at the point of when you're actually looking at a property in the first place, because what you want to be doing is essentially establishing what amount of it, whether there are any allowances actually available within that property. It shouldn't be the deciding factor. Obviously, the GDV or whatever the rental income or whatever the profit you're going to get from it is the deciding factor. The capital allowances will always be a cherry on top to make the acquisition more viable and allow you to retain more of your income. However, the right time to engage engage us with regards to capital allowances is prior to acquisition, purely because at that point there are so many kind of bits and bobs within the legislation that restrict you from claiming capital allowances that you want to be able to retain your right to claim upon completion. So at that point, you want to be thinking about looking at the legalities and seeing what restrictions there are to claim, and putting some clauses maybe into the contract in order to retain your right to claim capital allowances upon completion, whether that be you need permission from the prior owners to be able to claim, whether there be some kind of stipulation within the contract that you need to amend before you complete an exchange on the property, just to make sure that you retain your right to claim. Whether or not you're going to claim the allowances upon completion is a different matter, but what you don't want to do is lose the ability to claim, because you might just as well flip that property later on, and you want to be able to retain those allowances for the next person to be able to utilize the allowances, because if you've not done your homework, then that person loses out. And we're seeing more and more of that since the rule change in 2014.
And so just to expand on what you've just said there, it literally is when you're buying the property to make sure the paperwork and the contractual agreements are correct in order to retain your rights and ability to be able to claim at some point in the future, or even who you sell on to has that right.
Absolutely. So every commercial acquisition will come with a CPSC document, the Commercial Property Standard Inquiries document, and Section 32 is all about capital allowances. So that section we want to make sure is fit out properly and is compliant and it's not been completed negligently. More often than not, we just see the boxes say nil or not applicable. The hell does that mean? Does it mean we have no idea? So it just leaves you in the dark. So we want to make sure that that's done properly. It could be just £1 and £1 where they've restricted you from claiming. We need to make sure that that's not in there either, unless it's actually correct, because most solicitors will just put that in because they don't know about capital allowances. They haven't consulted a specialist. So they just put that in there because it's a quick win and it's an easy fix. But they don't realize the implications of the fact that they're restricting your right to claim upon completion just by putting that in there. So we want to be on hand to make sure that you don't fall for those kind of little mistakes that might.
And if you're purchasing a property and let's say you were unaware, you've already purchased, and you now decide you want to make a claim, you may need to go back to try and tidy up some of this paperwork. Could the seller or who you bought the property from hold you to ransom at this stage, or?
So typically, if you're buying a property, we want to be able to retain your right to claim upon completion and quite quickly, because once it's done and enough time has passed, the vendor's going to be gone. You're going to struggle to get a hold of it.
Very difficult.
So everything really does need to be done within 3 months of completion, exchange of completion. If you've got a historical purchase, then we just work with what we have, and there are ways around that as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's dead in the water. It could be, that the prior owner wasn't entitled to claim, which means that you're completely unrestricted. It might be a partial restriction, which means that there's still elements for you to claim. There is a fair bit of diligence that we need to do in order to establish your right to claim, and that is part of the parcel. But there's absolutely no issue with looking at historical purchases because we do that all day long. I mean, I've got a client who's bought properties in the 70s, and aside from the fact that it doesn't qualify for both pools of allowances, just the main rate, and we're restricted to his purchase price. I mean, the typical one is like an £89,000 retail unit that he purchased. It's worth like 1.5 million now because it's in East London.
Yes.
But we're restricted to the purchase price that he paid at that time.
So, you'd be limited to what was paid for at that time, basing your claim on what was already with the property. But any additional work that's done or modification change,
completely separate claim.
Okay, so that's.
But the point we're making is the fact that historical purchases, there's legs in that as well.
Yeah.
So it's not to say there's nothing on the table. Everything is worth looking into, no matter how long you've owned it for.
Yeah. So I said even though typically it needs to be within a few months, you gave an example there, something that was from the 70s.
And there was still a massive potential to claim for that client because he had a massive portfolio and there was loads there. And typically those properties, it worked purely because if you look at it, it's just a tiny unit in East London. It's not worth 1.5 million, but the land value is such. The lower purchase price actually worked because the embedded capital allowances actually were valued and worked out well with that purchase price because there's not much in them,
Yes.
Yeah.
And help people understand with this. So when a capital allowance claim is made, do HMRC come and knock on your door and present you with a check, or how does it work?
So the process is just giving a generic overview of what it is. So essentially, once we've done the diligence, we've established your right to claim. You've bought an office, let's say for argument's sake, £1 million, and we've done our diligence, and you're entitled to claim capital allowances. We would come out, we would do a site inspection, we would quantify all of the capital allowances that are embedded within the property, and we would produce a HMRC compliant report. That report we would then submit to you and your accountants to review and come back to us with any queries, and then you literally submit those figures into your tax return. Once they're submitted into your tax return, they're accepted. That's it. It's done. It's like an expense. They pay now, ask questions.
That could be personal, LLP, limited company,
whatever entity you decide to buy, and that works for you. And that's it. It's accepted. So HMRC can make an inquiry into it at any given time. But that's all it is. It's just an inquiry. It's not an investigation, which is like a really big scare word. It's just an inquiry, which they can do with any expense. And that's for us to deal with. And we would look into that for you if we're the ones that have compiled the report. But that is it. And then literally, if we found you about £400,000 worth of allowances, what that means for you is that the next £400,000 worth of rental income, rental profits or trading profits will be tax-free until you've exhausted that full amount. And
so it's a tax allowance, essentially. That means you're not paying any tax up to that point for that period. And that could be for a few years. However long,
however ambitious you are, essentially. I mean, if you've got an office and you're trading out of it, however long it takes for you to earn £400,000 worth of income, it could be a year, it could be 10 years, however long it takes.
And for somebody starting out brand new, for example, let's say they're doing the first project, this could really make a difference to the attractiveness of the project.
We are seeing a lot of people who are getting into like the assisted living space and the service to accommodation space where the margins are quite thin, especially at the startup point. If we're able to come in and advise you on the capital allowances that are available and say, right, based on this and your acquisition and the money that you've spent, we'll be able to find you X amount of allowances, maybe 50,000, maybe 100,000. It makes all the difference because all of a sudden the numbers kind of stack up and it makes it more viable if you're able to retain all of your income for the first 2 to 3 years potentially. And it just makes the deal stack up in that regard. And if you're doing multiple acquisitions, you're just stacking up all these allowances against all of them and you're tax-free. How you decide to use that benefit, I mean, if essentially if you're claiming it for the first time, you've just acquired the property, it's mitigation going forward. So you're just wiping out a tax bill. If it's something that you've owned for a while historically, then what we can do is we can go back 2 years. The current year can be amended and mitigated. The last year is still open and amendable. We can claim a rebate on that last tax year that you pay tax. How you decide to use that rebate, whether we want to take it in cash, that's down to your accountant. Your accountants more often than not will just push it forward and wipe out anything else going forward. So you don't see anything. But yeah, there are so many different ways to utilize this benefit.
And service accommodation, definitely a hot topic right now. A lot of people doing it. But there's many people that are doing rent to service accommodation, so they don't own the property. So you can only make a claim on an asset you own. But how can this help getting a deal done when somebody else owns it? So Usman, commercial property is very popular right now. A lot of people are looking into commercial because buy-to-let is just not as viable as it used to be. And so give me an example of like if someone's purchasing a commercial building, maybe there's office space above it and retail, that typical type of layout, and they're going to keep it, maybe it's commercial or even convert some of it. What would that look like for somebody?
So one that we were working on recently, it was a typical office to resi conversion, but it had mixed use on the ground floor as well. So the offices, about 3 floors worth of offices above, in fairly decent condition, to be fair, and could be ready to go. So one of the plans was to keep it and run it as serviced offices, but in the end, the numbers stacked up better to do a conversion to resi. The ground floor mixed retail was just a mixture of like a club, a bar kind of thing, an estate agent, and another convenience store. So he had sitting tenants. The estate agent was still running, so he kept that as it is, and he had a convenience store, and that was running as is. So he was getting income from the get-go. And then it was a case of just stripping out the bar and making multiple units within that, so he could increase his rental yield. And then the above was going to be converted to residential, essentially. And he used the above office space as his base of operations, and just had kind of like a little office set up there whilst he was doing the conversion. So he purchased that for 4.1 million.
Okay.
Pretty much everything in the property qualified because he bought it from a trust, and the trust was held offshore. So the prior owners weren't entitled to claim, which meant...
So that's a key thing you've just shared there, just to kind of clarify. So in certain instances, certain entities can't claim.
Yes. So anything that's tax efficient. So if you're buying a property from a pension fund, a trust, a charity, ex-local authority, they're all tax efficient. They don't pay tax. So for that reason, they will never have been entitled to claim capital allowances, which means that you as a new owner are the first entitled person to be able to claim without any restrictions to claiming.
It's pretty much a done deal if you're buying off one of these entities that they won't have already claimed, and you'll be entitled to that claim.
Perfect case scenario for us, because there's literally no diligence to be done. We can just jump right in and say, right, that's it. That's clear cut. That's what it is. I'm working right now where I'm just trying to clarify whether the trustees of the previous kind of thing, whether they are in fact a trust. Sometimes with trusts, it can be that they are tax paying. It's not always that necessarily that they're tax efficient. So there is diligence to be done. But in this scenario specifically, it was held offshore, and it was a tax efficient vendor based on whatever they held it in. So our client was completely unrestricted in it being able to claim capital allowances. So we had the run of the mill. We could claim absolutely everything throughout the property. And we did. So we did a claim for them, and on his £4.1 million purchase price, I think we found about 1.7, just shy of 1.7, because the office was fully loaded. It was massive. It was like in excess of a 40% claim.
And when it's fully loaded, that a huge amount of plant and
machinery. I mean, he had an elevator in there, which added significant value. He had a really significant fire alarm kind of system in there. There was a dry riser, which added massive value. There was loads of solar kind of bits on the roof as well, along with the telecommunications. Tons of ventilation, and there was lots of kind of entertainment elements in there as well, because the office prior had like a kind of kitchenware that was more extensive than we typically find in an office. But it was really, really fully loaded with all the kind of typical plant machinery. And then the mixed use retail kind of units below, even they were quite extensively fit out. The club had loads of stuff in it. I mean, there was a bar and all the rest of it in there, and a massive kitchen in the back. And then, yeah, they're just units where they were. But essentially, an office is a high ticket item when it comes to capital allowances. So we were able to identify that amount of allowances, and then he just pulls those allowances and sits on them, and they will wait, and they'll be ready for him to use once he does the conversion, or even immediately, because he has sitting tenants with the estate agents and the convenience store as it was.
So the profit being generated from those rentals right now,
straight away,
all that will become tax-free effectively up to that amount.
Exactly.
So that allowance is being utilised.
Because there's no time restriction, so however long it takes, those allowances will sit there, and they will keep on rolling over until he's utilised them.
And that's massive, which is why, when I first understood it, I thought it was shocking. Why doesn't everybody else understand this? And it is quite complex. It's not that simple. And what we're, I guess, trying to do here is just get people to understand, overall, this is what it is, and this is how you can benefit from it.
The complications of it are for me to deal with, and already kind of capital allowances specialist, whoever you choose to appoint. However, you do need to know the basics and need to know what qualifies. Using the guy with the house fridge, for example, he knew it applied to his smaller jobs, but didn't realize that the most viable one it didn't apply to. So you just need to understand the mechanics of it and realize that, right, I can apply this to this to this.
Yes.
And that's essentially what I want to do, is just raise awareness around the subject, that everyone is incorporating this into their property strategy, because without these allowances, this particular guy, I mean, how much would he have lost out on there? That's insane.
It's crazy.
Insane amount of it. And he was just going to strip it. And throw all that stuff away, and it's all value, and all we're doing is monetizing that and recouping what he's incurred in expenditure buying that property back as tax relief, essentially making more viable. Once he does his conversion, there'll be an element of the communal that we can do as claim capital allowances on, and once he does the mixed retail below and separates the units out and does whatever he's going to do there, that'll be an additional refurb claim that we can add in addition to the originally pulled allowances from the purchase.
So to clarify that, so the first claim of 1.7 was on the existing building.
As it was.
And then once the conversion is done, the retail units are being created downstairs, the apartments upstairs, the communal space upstairs, and the work done downstairs, a portion that will also be able to make a new claim as well.
A much higher portion, because that's all new expenditure, and there isn't going to be too many structural alterations, because essentially the structure is what we discount, but they're not building anything. They're just kind of putting a few partitions in and so on. The majority of that fit out will qualify for capital allowances. So on that, with regards to a refurb claim, it's a much higher percentage. It could be anywhere up to like 80% of your expenditure if you're just doing a fit out, which is typically what we see. especially if one of his plans was, it was already an office, he was just going to refit it and make it a more brand spanking new serviced office. It would have just been a fit out. It would have been almost 100% of whatever he incurred in expenditure, converting it or refurbing it would have qualified for capital allowances.
Yes.
So it's massive in that regards.
And then when someone's thinking about capital allowances, what would you say kind of like 3 tips to be just mindful of when you're doing any kind of property transaction to ensure that you are thinking about capital allowances?
You want to ask the question first off, whether the vendor has actually claimed capital allowances. There's no point being shy about it. I mean, depending on the circumstances, but more often than not, you want to ask the question and find out what they've done.
And if they don't know what you're talking about, it's very likely they haven't.
Which is perfect. Then that means that's what we want them to say, that we don't even know what capital allowances are. What's this all about? So keep them in the dark with it, because you want to claim the allowances and you don't want them to retain the right to claim. So yeah, want to ask the question, find out what it is. You want to know as much prior ownership history going back to like 2008. So we can establish who's owned it in all that time and whether there are any restrictions within that period. So that's typically the first things I would ask. Give me the prior ownership history going back to 2008 so I can piece it all together. They haven't claimed any capital allowances. Have they done any refurb works in recent times? Because it could be that they would have refurbed the property like a couple of years prior to you buying it.
Yeah.
The accountant could just as easily have claimed that refurb works, which means that there's nothing actually original within that property anymore that you're buying because everything's already been claimed on.
Right.
So there's so many like little implications with regards to the diligence that needs to be done. And again, it's not something that I want to bombard people who are watching the video with. This is something for us to deal with, but these are the questions they need to be asking, just getting as much prior ownership history as possible. And then just making sure that you're in a position that you're going to be entitled to claim as well, because once you've done all that, we may need to put some clauses in the contract in order to retain your right to claim capital allowances upon completion, just to keep the vendor on board in order to be compliant with your request to be able to claim capital allowances should we require their permission to be able to claim. But that is it. It's just a few kind of stepping blocks that they need to incorporate into their property strategy every single time whenever you're acquiring a commercial property, just to make sure you don't lose your right to claim. Once you've done it once, it'll become second nature and you'll do it with every single one. But it's just one of those things that people need to be doing so they're not missing out. If you're entitled to claim capital allowances and you're not claiming, you're nuts. Because as we were saying earlier, I'll meet a client and they'll say yeah, okay, fine, sounds all great and all the rest of it, but I'm not interested at this point. But the minute their tax bill is due, fine, go ahead, pay them the 30, 40 odd grand or just get us to wipe it all out for you. It's a no-brainer. This service sells itself. You're entitled to claim, you need to be claiming this, because why would you pay the tax man any additional unnecessarily? We can wipe it out for you. Let's wipe it out for you. That's what we're here to do.
Another really popular strategy being service accommodation. Have you got an example you can share with us in terms of how, for example, someone setting up a service accommodation business, how the capital allowances would work for them?
So I'll be honest with you, service accommodation, even assisted living to some extent, is our bread and butter. I love it because it's easy, only because there is some qualifying criteria with both strategies. But more often than not, people are just buying residential units and converting them into service accommodation. So you're taking a residential property and you're bringing it into commercial use. There's no restrictions to claiming because it's residential. You bought it into commercial use. You're the first person who's entitled to claim, so you're completely unrestricted. And typically, we do find between 35, 40% of the purchase price on residential units because they are, they have loads of stuff in there. Most people will go in, do some kind of a cosmetic refurb, maybe some light kind of painting and decorating, depending on how dilapidated it is. But yeah, essentially the claim is based on the purchase. We would find, if you're buying a unit for like say 250,000, then we'll be finding you close to like about 60, 70,000 pounds worth of allowances based on that purchase price. It's massively viable if we're giving you about 70,000 pounds worth of income tax profits tax-free for you to utilize against that business. It works absolutely fine. Service accommodation, the only kind of qualifying criteria is, I think HMRC sets it whereby it needs to be available for at least 210 days of the year. You have to have no lettings over 30 days, and that's the kind of criteria. We need to make sure that you hit that and you are doing that and you have sufficient kind of bookings to start, essentially require you to claim capital allowances, because it might be in the first year you might not be hitting all of the kind of profit.
So you've got to put both feet in one camp. It's not, well, I do some long-term lets and I do some service accommodation in the same property.
There might be an averaging election involved there because some of the income qualifies and some of it doesn't. But what I would say is, I would say typically start running it for only 6 to 9 months and get in touch with us after that, and then we'll have a look at doing a claim. We don't want to do it on day one. We get loads of people coming up and saying, I want to do it straight away before I strip it out and all the rest of it, but there's no point because it could be that the numbers don't stack up. I can only add value if you're absolutely smashing it. If those profits are there and there's a tax bill that needs to be wiped out, then that's where I add value. If it's not, then I would say we're not going to claim anything this year. Let's wait until next year.
Yes.
And we'll just do it in the next year. And providing you hit the criteria then and you're smashing it and you've got the bookings and you're making that money, because more often than not with service accommodation, it's such a difficult strategy. Yes. It's not for everyone. There's a lot of legs involved in getting that up and running. Some people revert back to AST It's not for them. So that's why
they dip their toe in, try it, and then they find it's not for them.
So we work methodically.
Yeah.
We want to work with you. We want to work with your cash flow. We want to make sure that everything works for you and that we're adding value. It's not about just fleecing you at the get-go. We need to make sure that everything works for you. And with assisted living as well. I mean, we often find that if someone does an assisted living unit, again, the same thing, they'll buy a residential property, they'll convert it to whatever requirement that a registered provider will need. They get it up and running. We provide them with the allowances. The registered provider, once they've given them one property, they're like, right, this is really good, give us another one. And they'll go out on a spending spree. And then they massively incorporate capital allowances into their property strategy because they don't want to be paying any tax on any of those properties for the foreseeable. And it makes it that much more viable when it's already tight as it is, because I think the incomings from assisted living is slightly less than you get on a typical kind of AST or anything else, from my experience anyway. So the allowances make all the difference.
Yes,
massively.
Completely change.
It makes it much more viable if you're able to retain all of your income that you are getting from it.
Usman, we've covered a huge amount, and I thought I'd speak quickly, but you speak super fast. So maybe people want to go back or watch this at half speed.
Maybe.
There's so much content that you've just shared.
So anyone who's watching will know that that's something I'm working on. I do try. I've slowed down massively. Like I'm more coherent now than I used to be. But yeah, this is probably
Just goes to show your brain works so fast.
We're embedded with that kind of time is money, right? It's time to breathe, and yeah.
So if people want to reach out to you, connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
They can find me on all the socials. Typically, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, I'm on LinkedIn. The company is called James Azir & Co. So info@jamesazir.com. They can reach out and send us an email. Our website has loads of information around capital allowances, a guide that you can download. So
resources,
the website, case studies. There is even a newsletter that we put out on the regular every time there's a budget announcement, because there's been loads of new additions to the kind of capital allowances regime that they've announced recently. There's the inclusion of the first year allowance up to £1 million, where people can write off up to £1 million worth of allowances in the first year. They've recently announced full expensing. So if you've incurred expenditure in excess of £2 million, we can now fully expense all of your expenditure after that point. It's massive. It's brought capital allowances to the forefront as one of the best tax breaks that you can claim now and utilize. It's amazing. It is kind of geared towards more the big boys, but we're doing what we can to assist the SME market. That's our bread and butter, the SME market, and that's who we're here to help and add value to and assist with.
Yeah, so if you're watching and listening to this right now, I'd encourage you to connect with you, understand how you can benefit from it, because you're really saving huge amounts of money on every property deal you're doing.
So, I mean, we said earlier how every case is different. I mean, you could buy a property and I'll buy a property, but the benefit to both of us will be completely different. Everything needs to be assessed on its own merits, case by case basis. And yeah, we need to do that. We've given a generic overview of capital allowances, but
because it's a very complex area of tax, essentially.
But it's not a one size fits all at all. Every single case will have its own nuances and all its own complexities, and we need to deep dive and figure out what we're looking at and make sure that we've analyzed everything properly. Because more often than not, it does happen whereby we'll go through all the compliance, we'll make sure we've done all the diligence, and we get to just the point where we're about to survey the property, and then something comes out of the woodwork and it's like, oh, we can't claim because of that, because such and such, and you've done this, or you've got this, or you've bought it in this manner, or something like that. So there's so many different things. Whether you buy an LLP, your personal name, in a partnership, in a limited company, there could be something that's restricting your right to claim. We've got loads of people who are buying properties and coming to us saying, I want to claim capital allowances, but they've used a massive portion of their SAS to purchase the property, which means that we can't qualify any of that income. Their SIP, it's just there's so many different things. Or they've had government grants. That's a massive one with assisted living. They get government grants to pay for portions of refurbs and so on, which means that so what did you spend on the refurb? 600 grand, but 550 of that was from a government grant. We only spent 50 of our own money, and I was like, okay, well, that's not your money, so we can't claim on it. So it's only 50 grand. So there's so many bits that we need to do, but that's for us to deal with. For you guys, it's just a case of
area specialist.
Be aware of capital allowances, be aware of what it's about, what it applies to, and how it's relevant to you. And let us assist you and make your commercial acquisitions much more viable, much more profitable, and save you as much money as possible. The more you buy, the more we will assist you with, and the more we save you, the more you'll be able to buy.
Yes. Usman, it's a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you,
my friend. Thank you.